At this point, I'm hoping you feel comfortable with some of the basic concepts and measurements that are often tossed around in discussions of macroeconomics. I'm hoping you feel comfortable with how GDP is measured, and also with the 4 macroeconomic goals of economic growth, low unemployment, low inflation, and a sustainable balance of trade. But it is a hard fact that having 4 separate goals can cause confusion, because it raises a question about whether it's possible to reach all of the goals at roughly the same time, or if there are inevitable trade-offs between the goals. For example, it is impossible to accomplish simultaneously the 4 goals of being in Los Angeles, London, Beijing, and Rio de Janeiro. But if your 4 goals are to visit the Statue of Liberty, the Empire State Building, the New York Stock Exchange, and a Broadway show, then all 4 goals can be accomplished with a single trip to New York City. Are the 4 goals of macroeconomics, economic growth, low unemployment, low inflation, and a sustainable balance of trade, like trying to visit 4 completely different cities, in the sense that it's impossible to achieve all 4 at the same time? Or is it possible for an economy to attain several or all of its macroeconomic goals at more or less the same time? To think about this issue, we need an organizing framework for how to think about the macroeconomy. And the basic framework most commonly used is the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So what I want to do in this lecture is to lay out the ideas of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Let's start with aggregate supply. Aggregate supply is limited by potential GDP, where potential GDP is the amount that the economy can produce if all resources in the economy are fully employed. At potential GDP, cyclical unemployment would be 0, and so any remaining unemployment would be accounted for by the natural rate of unemployment. Sometimes potential GDP is referred to as full employment GDP, because it refers to the notion that everyone is employed, and also that the machinery and the capital equipment in the economy is fully employed as well. When we think about the aggregate supply of the economy, that is, the total amount that an economy can produce, it's going to be limited. The most it can do is potential GDP. Now, let's think about why aggregate supply might shift. What will change what an economy is capable of producing? There are really 2 main reasons. One is technological growth, and the other would be a sharp change in the conditions of production that affected many firms across the economy. So let's think about each of these in turn. The process of productivity growth over time means greater output per hour. In essence, it means the productive potential of an economy is expanding over time. Remember from our earlier lecture that the fundamental determinants of economic growth are increases in human capital, in physical capital, and in technology over time. And with gradual increases in all 3 of these, you can imagine potential GDP and aggregate supply slowly rising steadily over time. For a high-income country like the US, maybe rising 2 or 3% a year. But at certain times, there are going to be sharp changes in the conditions of production, and those might reduce what an economy is able to produce. The classic example here is the sharp increases in oil prices that the US economy experienced in the 1970s. Oil is very widely used in the US economy, and of course energy, including natural gas and other things, are even more widely used. So when the cost of energy rose, it drove up the costs of production for many, many industries all at the same time. This was a negative shock to aggregate supply. And while the economy went through a period of adjustment, a period of transition, for some period of time, the economy was able to produce less than it had been before all the costs of energy rose so dramatically. So, there we've got an idea of aggregate supply. Let's now switch over and think about the idea of aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is determined by its 5 components. And as I've said several times now, its components are C plus I plus G plus X minus M. That is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. Back in lecture 19, the discussion of what GDP was and how it's measured pointed out that GDP could be measured either by what the economy produced or equivalently by the main sources of demand in the economy. And so in terms of the framework we're using here, you can think of aggregate supply as, of course, what the economy produces, and then you can think of aggregate demand in terms of those main ingredients of aggregate demand that we talked about when we were measuring GDP. Remember that of the components of aggregate demand, consumption is the biggest one, at 2/3 or more of GDP most years. Investment is smaller, but it's the most volatile, bouncing up and down. Government spending is perhaps under the most direct policy control at any given time. And exports and imports, the demand components there, are heavily shaped by what's happening in other countries. But as these factors shift, that is, consumption, investment, government spending on goods and services, and exports and imports, shifts in those factors will lead to corresponding changes in aggregate demand and make it go up or down. Now, for the economy as a whole, the quantity of aggregate supply must equal the quantity of aggregate demand. But there are competing theories of macroeconomics. One theory argues or emphasizes that aggregate supply really creates or drives aggregate demand. The opposing theory puts aggregate demand first and suggests that aggregate demand creates or drives the quantity of aggregate supply. So let's run through these two theories in turn. A famous French economist of the early 19th century named Jean-Baptiste Say is credited with Say's Law. And Say's Law is supply creates its own demand. Now, as a matter of historical accuracy, it seems clear that Jean-Baptiste Say never actually wrote down this law, and moreover seems clear that the law oversimplifies his beliefs. Indeed, there's sort of a running joke among academic economists that every so-called law of economics is named after someone who didn't quite believe it. But Say's law lives on as a useful shorthand for summarizing a certain point of view. How does supply create demand at the macroeconomic level? Well, each time a good or service is produced and sold, it represents income that is earned for someone. It might represent income for a worker, or a manager, or an owner, or those who are workers and managers and owners at firms that supplied inputs down the chain of production to the firm that did the actual selling. Now, of course, in individual markets, prices and wages will rise and fall depending upon microeconomic supply and demand in each market. But bottom line, from a macroeconomic point of view, every sale represents income to someone. And so, Say's law argues, a given value of supply in a macroeconomic sense must create an equivalent value of income and demand somewhere else in the economy. Now, because Jean-Baptiste Say and Adam Smith and other economists writing around the turn of the 19th century who discussed this point of view were called the classical economists, modern economists who subscribe to a version of Say's law that supply creates its own demand are typically called neoclassical economists. The main challenge for Say's law and neoclassical economics is recessions. I mean, after all, if aggregate supply always creates exactly enough aggregate demand at the macroeconomic level, then why should a recession ever happen? Why should there ever be high unemployment? Why should the economy ever contract? And just for the record, to be fair to good old Jean-Baptiste Say, he was perfectly aware of this problem, and it's one of the reasons he didn't completely believe what we now call Say's law. Even if total supply, aggregate supply in the economy, always creates an equal amount of aggregate demand, the economy could still experience a situation where some firms are earning profits and other firms are earning losses. But a recession, remember, is not a situation where business failures are being counterbalanced by an offsetting number of successes. A recession is a situation in which the whole economy is shrinking in size. Business failures heavily are outnumbering the few remaining success stories. Many firms are ending up suffering losses and laying off workers. So it's difficult to explain how if supply always creates its own demand, how an economy can get into that situation. The alternative to Say's law, with its emphasis on aggregate supply, can be named Keynes Law. And we'll call that demand creates its own supply, after the great 20th century British economist John Maynard Keynes. Now, as a matter of historical accuracy, just as Jean-Baptiste Say never wrote down anything as simple-minded as Say's law, John Maynard Keynes never wrote down anything as simple as what I'm calling Keynes' law. But the law is still a useful simplification that conveys a certain point of view. When John Maynard Keynes was writing his great work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, during the Great Depression of the 1930s, he pointed out that during the Depression, the capacity of the economy to supply goods and services really had not changed by much. U.S. unemployment rates were higher than 20% between 1933 and 1935, but the number of possible workers, the number of potential workers, had not increased or decreased much. In that time period, factories are closed and shuttered, but the machinery and the equipment and the potential supply from that machinery and equipment hadn't disappeared. Technologies that had been invented in the 1920s were not disinvented and forgotten in the 1930s. Thus, Keynes argued that the Great Depression, and many ordinary recessions as well, are not caused by a drop in the ability of the economy to supply goods, at least as measured by the ability to supply as measured by labor and physical capital and technology. But instead, Keynes argued, economies went into a recession because a lack of demand in the economy as a whole, a lack of aggregate demand, led to inadequate incentives for firms to produce. Keynes argued the level of GDP in the economy was thus not primarily determined by the potential of what the economy could supply, but rather by whether there was enough total demand to encourage firms to take advantage of that potential supply. In his mind, a greater amount of aggregate demand could thus call forth an increase in supply and move an economy out of a recession. What's the main conceptual challenge for Keynes' law? Well, if aggregate demand is all that matters at the macroeconomic level, then the government could make the economy as large as it wanted just by pumping up total demand through a large increase in government spending or by enormous tax cuts to push up consumption. After all, just push up demand as high as you possibly can, and if demand creates its own supply, then the result should be that you can make the economy infinitely large with infinitely large tax cuts. But economies do face genuine limits on how much they can produce at a point in time. Those genuine limits are determined by the quantity of labor and physical capital and technology, as well as by the market structures and the institutions of the economy that bring these factors of production together. These constraints on what an economy can supply at the macroeconomic level don't disappear just because there was some increase in demand. So, fundamental problem. Why don't aggregate supply and aggregate demand match up? In the short run, aggregate demand might not increase smoothly with aggregate supply for at least two reasons. One is that there can be fluctuations in business and consumer confidence, and that can cause firms and consumers to bunch their aggregate demand at certain time periods. That could cause the level of aggregate demand in the economy to fall short of potential GDP, or sometimes even to exceed potential GDP, at least in the short run. When firms are thinking about whether it's a good time to invest, they look out at the economy as a whole and they sort of think to themselves, does this look like a time when if we put in the costs of an investment, we'll get a relatively quick future payoff? Or does it look like a time when the future payoff might be deferred quite a few years, and so we should wait and do it at some point in the future? When firms are pessimistic or uncertain about the economic future, they put off their investment projects, or at least some of them, they postpone some into the future. And then when businesses think the economy is doing well and they become more optimistic, they often have a backlog of projects that they've sort of got all ready to go and all ready to start up all at once. And this is, of course, one reason why the investment component of aggregate demand is likely to surge and decline so rapidly. An example. In the second half of the 1990s, the U.S. economy experienced a wave of new information and communications technologies, including the internet, technologies that involve computing, vastly improved mobile phones. So U.S. investment levels surged at this time from about 18% of GDP in 1994 up to 21% of GDP by the year 2000. However, a recession starts in the U.S. economy in 2000, and many firms came to believe that the returns from investing in new computers and new equipment, at least for any additional investment, was not as high as they had been thinking. So